Okay, so today we're diving into a pretty big one, learner.
Yeah, no kidding.
The question of whether God exists.
Right.
And we're looking at the transcript of this debate between William Lane Craig, the Christian philosopher,
Yes.
and Christopher Hitchens.
The author and well-known atheist.
Yeah, and this was a big event, it sounds like.
Oh, it was huge. Yeah, it was held at Biola University,
Oh, wow.
which is, a pretty significant Christian institution.
Okay, yeah.
And they had almost 3,000 people there in person.
Wow.
And then tons more were watching online, like across 30 states, and even in other countries like Stockholm and Sri Lanka.
So this is a really international discussion.
Oh, absolutely. And the fact that it was the associated students of Biola University who actually put this whole thing together really tells you how important this question is. Especially for people who are, in that stage of life.
Yeah, definitely.
Like really trying to figure things out.
For sure.
And, both Craig and Hitchens have written these, really important books that kind of lay out their main ideas.
Okay.
So Craig's is called Reasonable Faith.
Okay.
And then Hitchens is a really provocative one.
Yeah.
God is not great.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, those titles alone tell you a lot about where they're coming from.
Yeah, exactly.
So, learner, we're going to be your guides
Yes.
through all of this. And I'm the one who's like, super into all these big questions and kind of just trying to, make sense of it all.
And I'll be here to offer a more analytical perspective,
Right.
helping us connect all the different pieces.
Yeah, perfect.
And see the bigger picture of what they're both getting at.
Love it. Okay, so Craig kicks things off with this thing called the cosmological argument.
Right.
And basically, it boils down to this super deep question, like, why is there anything at all instead of just nothing?
Yeah, it's like the most fundamental question you could possibly ask.
Right, like it just stops you in your tracks.
Totally. And Craig actually quoted Derek Parfit, who said this really amazing thing.
Oh, yeah.
He said, "No question is more sublime than why there is a universe where there is anything rather than nothing."
Wow. I mean, yeah, that really captures it, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally. So what's really interesting is how Craig uses this seemingly simple question to get into some really complex philosophical territory.
Okay.
So he starts talking about this argument against the idea of an infinite past. So basically he's saying that if the universe never had a beginning,
Okay.
it would lead to all these logical contradictions, if you really think about it.
Like what kind of contradictions?
Well, imagine if you had an infinite number of past events.
Okay.
He even brings in this mathematician, David Hilbert, who said this famous quote
Okay.
about how the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. So the idea is that past events are real things.
Right.
So there can't be an infinite number of them. There has to have been a beginning.
I see.
It makes you wonder if infinity is even a concept that applies to the actual world,
Yeah, right. Like
Yeah.
it seems like something that works in math, but maybe not in reality.
Right, exactly.
So then Craig brings in the Big Bang Theory,
Right.
which is mind-blowing in itself.
Oh, totally.
He argues that this event, 13 billion years ago, wasn't just about, stuff rearranging itself.
Right.
But it was the actual origin of all matter and energy, space, even time.
Yeah, it's like everything came from literally nothing.
And he quoted the physicist P.C.W. Davies on this, who called it a true coming into being of all physical things from nothing.
Exactly.
So how does that scientific idea of a beginning fit with the philosophical argument?
Well, if you put it all together, what Craig is ultimately saying is that the universe must have a cause.
Okay.
And because this cause would have to be outside of space and time,
Right.
it must also be uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and obviously super powerful.
Right.
But then he takes it even further and says that this cause has to be personal.
Okay, why personal?
Well, he's saying that the only things we know of that are outside of space and time are either abstract concepts or minds, a conscious mind.
Okay.
And abstract concepts can't really cause anything.
Right.
So he concludes that the origin of the universe must be this kind of transcendent, intelligent mind, as a personal creator.
So it's God is the only thing that fits the bill.
That's what he's arguing.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder if maybe there are other possibilities we just haven't thought of yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty bold claim, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so then Craig moves on to the teleological argument,
Right.
which is also called the fine-tuning argument.
Right.
And this one always blows my mind.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
He talks about how scientists have been totally shocked to discover that the universe is incredibly precisely set up for life to exist.
Yeah, it's like this crazy balancing act.
Right. Like the tiniest change and everything would be completely different.
Exactly. And Craig pointed out that there are two main aspects to this fine-tuning. So first you have the fundamental constants of nature.
Okay.
Like, you know, the strength of gravity or the speed of light.
Right.
These are the numbers that determine how the universe works at a basic level.
Okay.
And then there are these initial arbitrary quantities.
Okay.
Which are things that weren't like predetermined by the laws of physics.
Okay.
Like the amount of matter that existed right after the Big Bang.
I see.
And what's crazy is that both these constants and quantities fall within these super narrow ranges that allow life to be possible.
Wow.
Like one example he gave was the atomic weak force.
Oh, okay.
He said that if you change that by even 1 part in 10 to the 100th power.
Wow. That's a huge number.
I know, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have a universe that could support life.
So it's like every little dial is perfectly set.
Yeah, exactly. It
Wow.
really makes you wonder if it could all just be random chance.
No kidding.
You know?
Okay, so how does Craig explain this incredible fine-tuning?
Well, he goes through a few different possibilities.
Ah.
So first, he dismisses the idea that it's just physical necessity.
Okay.
He argues that these constants and quantities aren't, like, dictated by the laws of physics.
Okay.
They could have been different.
I see.
And then he argues against chance.
Oh.
Because the odds of everything just randomly falling into these life-permitting ranges are astronomically small.
Right. Like winning the lottery every day for 1,000,000 years, kind of small.
Uh-huh. Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
And he even addressed the multiverse hypothesis.
Oh, yeah. The idea that there are like infinite universes.
Right, exactly. And he pointed out that there's no real evidence for that.
Right.
And it has some pretty weird implications.
Like what?
Like Roger Penrose, this physicist, calculated that the random formation of our solar system is actually more likely than a finely tuned universe.
That's so bizarre.
It really is.
Okay, so if it's not physical necessity,
Right.
and it's not likely to be chance,
Right.
what's left?
Well, Craig says that the best explanation left is design.
A design, like someone designed it that way. Exactly.
But who designed the designer then?
Right. That's the classic question.
It's like it just pushes the problem back a step.
Right. But Craig's point is that design is still the most plausible explanation based on what we know.
Okay, I can see that.
So essentially, he's arguing that the fine-tuning of the universe points towards an intelligent designer, you know, like God.
Okay, so that's 2 arguments down.
Right.
What's next?
So then he gets into the moral argument.
Okay, the moral argument.
Yeah, and this one starts with a pretty strong statement.
Oh, yeah.
He says that if God doesn't exist,
Okay.
then objective moral values don't exist either.
Okay, so by objective, he means like moral values that are true regardless of what we believe.
Exactly. Like they're not just personal opinions or cultural norms.
Right.
They're like facts about the universe.
Okay.
And Craig even brings in this philosopher of science, Michael Ruse,
Okay.
who argued from an evolutionary perspective
Okay.
that morality is basically just a biological adaptation.
Like a useful illusion that helps us survive and reproduce.
Okay.
But it doesn't have any deeper objective reality.
I see.
And Craig pointed out that Hitchens himself seemed to agree that morality is basically a product of evolution.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does that lead to God?
Well, here's where it gets a little uncomfortable.
Okay.
So Craig's argument is that if morality is just a byproduct of evolution,
Okay.
then there's nothing objectively wrong with something like rape.
Wow. Okay.
It's just not socially advantageous
Yeah.
for our species.
Right.
But then he counters that by saying we all have this deep intuition that some things like rape or gratuitous cruelty are just objectively wrong.
Right. Like they're moral abominations.
Exactly. And if those objective moral values do exist,
Okay.
Craig concludes that God must exist as their ultimate source.
So like God is the guarantor of morality.
Right. He's the foundation for why those values are true and binding.
Okay. So it's like without God, everything is permitted.
That's kind of the implication.
Yeah.
It's a pretty heavy thought.
No kidding.
Okay, so moving on from there, Craig then talks about the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay.
So he presents Jesus as this historical figure who claimed to have divine authority
Right.
and performed all these miracles and exorcisms.
Okay.
And he says that the resurrection is like the ultimate proof of his claims.
Okay.
So it's not just about philosophy anymore. It's about actual events in history.
Right.
And Craig actually goes beyond just saying it's a matter of faith.
Okay.
He lays out what he considers to be 3 established historical facts
Okay.
that are recognized by a lot of New Testament scholars.
Okay. What are they?
So first, there's the empty tomb.
Okay.
And he even cites this scholar, Jacob Kramer,
Okay.
who says that the evidence for the empty tomb is pretty much undeniable.
Wow.
Then there are the appearances of Jesus after his death
Okay.
to various people and groups.
Okay.
And this includes some skeptics, too, like Paul.
Right.
And Craig even mentions Gerd Ludemann, who's a scholar who doesn't believe in the resurrection, but still acknowledges that these appearances happened.
Wow. So even the skeptics agree on that.
Yeah, which is pretty significant.
Okay, what's the third fact?
So the third fact is the sudden and radical change in the disciples' beliefs. So they went from being totally devastated and doubtful to like proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead.
Right.
And this is despite their Jewish background, where they didn't really have a concept of a Messiah who would die and come back to life.
Right, like that was not part of their worldview.
Exactly. And Craig cites N.T. Wright,
who's
a really prominent New Testament scholar.
Okay.
And Wright argues that the rise of early Christianity is just inexplicable unless something really dramatic happened.
Like the resurrection.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so how does he connect all this to God's existence?
Oh, he basically argues that all the naturalistic explanations for these facts just don't hold up.
Okay.
So the resurrection is the most plausible explanation. And because that's such a miraculous event, it points towards the existence of God.
Okay, so that's a pretty elaborate argument.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so is that all of Craig's arguments?
Well, actually, he has one more.
Okay.
He talks about the immediate experience of God. And he frames this not so much as a logical argument for God's existence, but more as a way of knowing that God exists.
Okay.
It's what philosophers call a properly basic belief.
Okay.
Kind of like how we trust our senses about the external world.
Okay.
Or how we just know that other people have minds.
Right.
We don't arrive at these beliefs through reasoning.
Right.
They're just grounded in our direct experience.
I see.
So Craig's point is that for people who genuinely seek God, he'll make his existence known through this kind of direct encounter.
Okay, so it's like a more personal way of knowing God.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack from Craig.
Yeah, he covered a lot of ground.
For sure.
Okay, so then it was Hitchens' turn. And right away, he wanted to clarify what atheism actually means.
Okay, yeah, that's a good place to start.
Right, because there are a lot of misconceptions out there.
Totally.
So he argued that atheism is simply the absence of belief in God.
Okay.
It's not about believing that God doesn't exist.
Right.
It's just about not having a belief that he does exist.
Okay, so it's like the default position.
Exactly. Like you don't start by believing in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy.
Right.
You only believe if you're given good reasons to.
Okay, I see.
So Hitchens is saying that atheists just haven't been given those good reasons to believe in God.
Okay, so it's about the burden of proof.
Exactly.
The theist has to prove that God exists.
Right.
The atheist doesn't have to prove he doesn't.
Exactly.
Okay, so then Hitchens brought up evolution.
Yes.
And he was basically saying that it kind of blows the whole idea of a designed universe out of the water.
Right. He pointed to all the vast timescales involved, all the cycles of birth and death and extinction. He even mentioned how humans almost went extinct like 180,000 years ago because of climate change.
Wow, yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
And he was questioning this idea that this whole process, which is often pretty brutal and random, was somehow intentionally designed with the goal of humans becoming Christians.
Yeah, it's like, if that was the plan, it seems like a really roundabout way to do it.
Right, exactly. And he even coined this term, retrospective evidentialism, to describe how some people tried to reinterpret evolution after the fact as being part of God's plan, even though it was originally opposed by a lot of religious groups.
Yeah, it's like they're just trying to fit the evidence into their pre-existing beliefs.
Right.
Okay, so what's the main point he's making with all this?
Well, I think it's a challenge to the coherence and morality of a divinely designed world.
Okay.
Especially when you look at it through the lens of evolution.
Right.
He's saying it's hard to reconcile the idea of an all-powerful and benevolent God with all the suffering and randomness we see in nature.
Okay, yeah, that's a classic problem. For sure.
Okay, so then Hitchens went on to talk about the lack of evidence for God's existence.
Yeah.
He was basically saying that there's no good reason to believe based on the evidence we have.
Right.
And that everything we observe can be explained without needing to bring God into it.
Right. He's advocating for a naturalistic worldview.
Right.
Where everything has natural causes.
Okay.
And he even brought up the problem of a deistic creator.
Okay, what's that?
So deism is the idea that there might have been some kind of creator who started the universe,
Okay.
but then just kind of stepped back and doesn't really intervene in the world.
Okay.
And Hitchens's point was that even if you accept that idea,
Okay.
it doesn't prove that this creator cares about us or answers our prayers or is involved in our lives in any way.
Right.
Theism goes way beyond that with all these extra beliefs.
Right. Like a personal God who loves us and wants a relationship with us.
Exactly.
Okay, so Hitchens is saying that there's no evidence for that.
Right.
It's just an assumption.
Okay, so he's really putting a lot of emphasis on evidence here.
Yeah, he is. And I think it reflects a different way of approaching knowledge.
Okay.
He's saying that we should base our beliefs on empirical observation and logical deduction,
Okay.
not on faith or tradition or anything like that.
So he wants the same kind of proof for God that we would demand for anything else.
Right.
Okay, so then he brought up this principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yes.
And he was basically saying that the claims of theism are definitely extraordinary.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like creating the universe and raising people from the dead.
Exactly.
So he's saying that the evidence needs to be really, really strong.
Right.
And he argued that the evidence presented by Craig just doesn't cut it.
Yeah, he wasn't convinced.
And he even pointed out that Craig himself said that the witness of the Holy Spirit is more important than arguments and evidence.
Right.
And Hitchens was like, well, that's just faith. That's not evidence.
Exactly. So he's using that to suggest that Craig is ultimately relying on subjective experience rather than objective proof.
Right. So it's like they're talking past each other.
In a way, yeah, they have different standards of evidence.
Okay, so then Hitchens did something really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
He started arguing against religion on moral grounds.
Right. He challenged this idea that religious people are inherently more moral than non-religious people.
Right.
He even asked if anyone could name a single ethical action that a believer can do that a non-believer can't.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Right. And then he went on to give all these examples of religiously motivated violence and oppression throughout history.
Like what?
Well, he talked about things like genital mutilation and suicide bombings and historical events like the Old Testament conquests
Okay.
and the Dutch Reformed Church's justification of apartheid
Right.
and the Greek dictatorship that was supported by the Orthodox Church
No.
and the Russian Orthodox Church's support for Putin, and even the complex relationship between Nazi Germany and various churches.
Okay, so he's painting a pretty bleak picture of religion's role in history.
Yeah, he's definitely not pulling any punches.
So what's his point with all these examples?
Well, I think he's trying to show that religion isn't necessarily a force for good in the world,
Okay.
and that morality can exist independently of religious belief,
Okay.
and maybe even more consistently.
Interesting. So he's flipping the script on the whole morality argument.
Yeah, he's saying that religion can be a source of harm just as easily as it can be a source of good.
Okay, so what about the fine-tuning argument?
So Hitchens was pretty skeptical of that one.
Okay.
He said it was just a form of pattern seeking based on limited evidence. He pointed out that physicists still don't fully understand the very early universe.
Right.
And he questioned whether we even need to invoke a designer to explain the fine-tuning.
Hmm.
He also brought up the problem of infinite regress.
Right.
Like, if God designed the universe, then who designed God? And he also pointed to all the imperfections and randomness we see in the universe.
Okay, like what?
Well, he mentioned things like shooting stars, which can be destructive,
Right.
and collapsing suns.
Okay.
And he even brought up the fact that the universe is eventually going to die.
Right, like the heat death of the universe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He said that in the end, everything will just fade into nothingness.
So he's saying that doesn't sound very designed.
Right. He's arguing that the universe doesn't really look like it was fine-tuned for life.
Okay.
Especially when you consider all the vast stretches of uninhabitable space.
Right.
And the fact that it's all going to end anyway.
Okay, so he's making a good counter-argument.
Yeah, he is.
Okay, so then they got to the cross-examination, and Hitchens had a chance to address some of Craig's arguments directly.
Yeah.
So first they talked about the definition of atheism and agnosticism.
Okay.
And Hitchens was very clear that he considers himself an atheist
Right.
because he hasn't seen any convincing evidence for God.
Right. And he kind of dismissed agnosticism as just sitting on the fence.
Okay, so he's not afraid to take a stand.
Nope, not at all.
Okay, what else did they talk about?
Well, they talked about the moral argument.
Okay.
And Hitchens admitted that morality could be a product of evolution.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But he still didn't think that made it any less real or important.
Right.
Okay, what about miracles?
So he questioned the historical accounts of miracles,
Okay.
especially the more outlandish ones like the virgin birth
Right.
and the resurrection of saints when Jesus died.
Okay.
And he said that even if miracles did happen,
Okay.
they wouldn't automatically prove that the person performing them was telling the truth.
Okay.
He even compared it to Pharaoh's magicians in the Bible,
Right.
who were able to do all sorts of magical things.
Right, but they weren't doing it with God's power.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he also pointed out that the Jewish authorities at the time didn't recognize Jesus as divine.
Good point.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the different religions?
So Hitchens explicitly said that he believes Islam is a false religion.
Wow. Okay.
And he questioned the morality of spreading falsehoods.
Right.
He even said that he would prefer an atheist baby
No.
over a Wahhabi Muslim baby.
Wow. All
Which
right.
is obviously a very provocative statement.
Yeah, I can see why people would find that offensive.
Right? But he's just being very blunt about his views.
Okay, so he's not afraid of controversy.
Not at all.
Okay. So then Craig had a chance to respond to all of that.
Right.
And he started by saying that atheism doesn't really have any positive arguments of its own.
Okay.
It's just defined by what it doesn't believe,
Right.
which is God.
Right.
And he said that atheism is just asserted without any real evidence.
Okay.
And then he reiterated his view that evolution doesn't contradict theism.
Okay.
And he even suggested that the improbability of evolution could actually be seen as evidence for God's involvement. So, like, God is guiding the process behind the scenes.
Right. And he also addressed Hitchens' question about why God waited so long to reveal himself, by pointing out that most of human history has actually happened since the time of Christ.
Right.
And he suggested that God's plan was unfolding in the fullness of time.
Okay. What does that mean?
Well, he said that maybe things like the preparation of Israel
Okay.
and the Roman peace
Okay.
and the spread of literacy were all part of God's plan.
So it's like God was setting the stage.
Exactly.
Okay, so he's trying to fit evolution into a theistic framework.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that a lot of modern theists are trying to do.
Right.
They want to reconcile science and religion
Right.
instead of seeing them as being in conflict.
Okay, so what else did Craig say?
Well, he clarified that he sees deism as a type of theism,
Okay.
but one that has a less involved God than classical theism.
Right.
And he emphasized that he's not claiming to have absolute certainty for his arguments.
Okay.
He's just saying that he thinks they're the most reasonable explanations based on the evidence.
Okay.
And he defended the idea of the witness of the Holy Spirit as being the main way of knowing that Christianity is true.
Okay.
And he said that logical arguments and historical evidence are just there to support that core belief.
Okay, so it's like faith comes first and then reason comes second.
Yeah, that's kind of how he sees it.
Okay.
And he also pointed out that Hitchens hadn't really refuted the basic premises of his cosmological argument.
Okay, so he's saying that his argument still stands.
Yep.
Okay, so it seems like Craig is trying to balance faith and reason.
Yeah, he's saying that reason can lead you to the door of faith,
Oh, okay.
but you need that personal experience to really step through it.
Okay, so then Craig responded to Hitchens' critique of the fine-tuning argument by saying that the eventual death of the universe doesn't really matter
Okay.
because the Christian worldview includes life after death, right?
So even if this universe ends,
Okay.
there's still an eternal existence with God.
Okay.
And he also clarified his moral argument.
Okay. He said that it's not about whether atheists can know right from wrong. It's about the foundation for those moral values.
Okay.
Like what makes them objectively true.
Right.
And he challenged Hitchens to explain how he could condemn past unethical systems without appealing to some kind of transcendent standard.
So like without God as the ultimate judge.
Right.
Okay.
And he also pointed out that believers have certain moral duties that non-believers don't.
Like what?
Well, like tithing
Right.
and loving God.
Right.
Those wouldn't apply to atheists.
Okay, so he's saying that theism actually adds moral obligations.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the resurrection?
So he brought up N.T. Wright's analysis again
Okay.
and said that the disciples wouldn't have gone from being so devastated to proclaiming Jesus' resurrection unless they had really seen the empty tomb and encountered the risen Jesus.
Okay.
And finally, he reaffirmed the idea that a personal experience of God is a valid basis for belief,
Okay.
just like any other basic belief we hold.
Okay, so he's covering all his bases
Yeah, he's systematically addressing all of Hitchens' criticisms.
and restating his own arguments.
Okay, so what did Hitchens say in his final remarks?
Well, he went back to this idea of how easily religious beliefs can spread.
Okay.
And he used the example of Mother Teresa's canonization.
Okay.
and how the miracle that was attributed to her was actually pretty controversial.
Hmm.
And then he came back to the moral question.
Okay.
And he said that neither belief nor unbelief guarantees good behavior.
Right.
He pointed out that there are plenty of examples of religious people doing terrible things.
Right.
And plenty of examples of atheists being morally upstanding.
Okay.
And he argued that religion is basically a way of trying to make sense of the contradictions in the world.
Okay.
But it's ultimately a human invention.
Mm.
And he said that's why there are so many different religions.
Right.
And why religion hasn't solved any of humanity's big problems.
Okay.
And he ended by saying that all the important questions about how to live together and what's right and wrong would still be there, even if religion disappeared. And he invited people to free themselves from what he called a celestial dictatorship.
Wow. So he's basically saying that we don't need God to be good.
Right. That's his main point.
Okay, so what about Craig?
So Craig countered by saying that Hitchens hadn't actually made any good arguments for atheism.
Okay.
He just attacked religion.
Right.
And he said that theism offers a much better explanation for a wide range of human experiences.
Okay.
And pointed out that Hitchens had basically ignored his cosmological and teleological arguments. And he went back to the moral argument.
Okay.
And said that atheism just can't account for objective morality.
Right.
He even quoted Hitchens' own words back to him.
Oh, yeah.
About how morality is just an evolutionary adaptation.
Okay.
And he challenged Hitchens to consider whether the ism might provide a better foundation for those values.
That's a good challenge.
Yeah.
Okay. What else did he say?
Well, he said that the resurrection of Jesus is still a plausible historical event.
Okay.
And he emphasized that the empty tomb was public knowledge.